this morning's program, it begins a series of 4 lectures by Dr. Robert Schmidt, and this series is entitled Toward a New World Order. And this first lecture in the series, A Fear of Our Future, especially addresses the humanist commitment of global awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, little up-tempo one.
Okay.
There's a house on a hill by a worn-down, weathered old mill in the valley below where the river winds. There's no such thing as bad time on a soft southern plain. Cotton Jenny's her name. She wakes me up when the sun goes down, and the wheels of love go round as the love go round. Love goes round, love goes round. It's a joyful sound. I ain't got a penny for Cotton Jenny to spend, but then wheels go round. When the new day begins, I go down to the Cotton Gin, and I make my time worthwhile to them. Then I climb back up again, where she waits by the door. Oh, Cotton Jenny, I soar, and she rubs my feet while the sun goes down, and the wheels of love go round, wheels of love go round. Love goes round, love goes round. It's a joyful sound. I ain't got a penny for Cotton Jenny to spend, but then wheels go round. In the hot, sickly South, when they say, well, shut my mouth, I can never be free from this cotton grind. But I know I've got what's mine on a soft southern plain. Oh, Cotton Jenny's her name. She wakes me up when the sun goes down, and the wheels of love go round, wheels of love go round. Love goes round, love goes round. It's a joyful sound. I ain't got a penny for Cotton Jenny to spend, but then wheels go round, wheels go round. Love goes round, wheels go round, love goes round.
That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we're in for a real treat. Back in, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Schmidt. And he's coming to us from over Zoom from Minnesota. But Dr. Schmidt was a very, very popular presenter here. And he did these 4-part series for us over 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013. And when I realized he was coming, I started to think about all the things I learned from him during these presentations, the idea of a world citizen, the idea of empire that lasts and has a time frame, just the idea that corporations become so big that they overpower countries and we become more of a global world because of international companies. And certainly these things are really coming to fruition when you look at Ron DeSantis and the fight he's having with Disney. I really thought about Dr. Schmidt's lecture. So Dr. Schmidt Dr. Schmidt has a Ph.D. in political science and several graduate degrees in theology. He has taught in Nigeria and lectured in Zimbabwe, Japan, China, India, Germany, and here in Portland at the Humanistic Greater Portland. So before his retirement, he was a professor of theology and political science at Concordia University here in Portland. So, Dr. Schmidt, it's so good to see you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Happy to be here.
It's so good. Are you ready to get started? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm ready to get started.
Well, just before we start, could you how you doing, buddy? We haven't seen you in a long time.
I grew a beard.
I noticed. All right. So,
But other than that, I'm the same guy.
okay, well, that's wonderful. We're in for a treat then, and a lot of good learning. So I'm going to turn this over to you.
You introduced me before by saying a new world order. Not quite. I'm starting with a society, and we'll go into that a little bit later. And today we're going to talk about fears for our world. And so today is going to be kind of a nasty lecture. It's going to be kind of negative, but it's just the beginning. And so we ask the question, with our fears, can we welcome hope? Here we go. The UN chief warns of climate change, war, pandemics, and disasters. And today we're going to talk about, first of all, fears for our world. Next week I'm going to be able to come and lecture in person. We're going to look at lessons from history. In the third week, we're going to look at paths for the future. And in the fourth week, coming together. Today, understanding our fears. And we're going to look at current fears. Then 2, what's really happening? Putting all those fears together, is there a pattern here? Something that's of real significance. We're going to look at the threat to the economy. Now here, the economy, we're not talking about recession in the next 2 years. We're going to talk about the economy in the next 50 years. Something a little broader. Then we're going to take a look at the threat to nations. And we're going to see that what we think is a pretty solid thing, maybe less solid than we think. And last of all, we're going to look at a current contradiction, and we'll explain that a little bit later. Current fears. One of them is the current climate change. Here are the floods in Pakistan. In my past, I had a chance to work on water management in West Pakistan. And we found out that one of the problems of West Pakistan is they had no place for water storage. 6 rivers flow through West Pakistan. And of course, with the extra rain caused by climate change, this last time it flooded and affected some 12 million people in Pakistan. It's unheard of, but tragic. And in Africa, drought. And drought, particularly in the Horn of Africa. Here are people who have lost their herds and wonder, what in the world do we do next? Worsening war. Here's the war in Ukraine and the question of tactical nuclear weapons. Hopefully that won't happen. But something else has happened. Is this the precursor to World War III? And of course, when we think of what would happen if the Chinese invaded Taiwan, and then the Quad came to their defense, Australia, the United States, India, would that start in a whole world war? Then the world rearms. I have the opportunity here to listen to the Japanese news through our public TV. Maybe you do too. Kishida of Japan, which up to this time has been somewhat of a pacifist country. They talk about their self-defense force. However, under Kishida, they're beginning to think we've got to double arms. They're extremely alarmed by the missiles that North Korea is being sent. And so they're doubling their defense budget. And not only them, Germany has stepped up its defense spending. Finland joins NATO, increases spending. Sweden wants to do the same. Because of the war in Ukraine and China, there's a threat to taking Taiwan by force, and armament is increasing across the whole world. And all of this is done in the name of keeping the peace. Except that some of us, knowing a little bit about history, say that's what they said before World War I. Everyone rearmed to make sure that they would keep the peace. But then somebody got shot in Serbia, and the whole deck of cards start falling apart. And so some of us are worried, with everybody rearming, could that happen here and now? We also have failing states. Sri Lanka had terrible problems, still does. Venezuela, 7 million people have left Venezuela. Libya still has not recovered after the bombing by the United States, France, and England. Lebanon has not recovered after the explosion and loss of economic prosperity. Syria still is not back together. Myanmar, ripped by a military takeover. Somalia is still a very split country. Haiti, oftentimes now thought to have been ruled by gangs because the government is so weak. Honduras, many of the refugees come from that place. Here's a picture of Myanmar. Myanmar now knows that in the north, some of the peoples in the north have guns, and so they're fighting the central government. And so you basically have the beginnings of even a civil war in Myanmar. Refugees and climate change. Here are Haitian immigrants at the US-Mexican border. Here are Africans headed to Italy. And as we know that this next week, we are going to have thousands more coming across the border in the south because of the lifting up of the COVID vaccine prohibition. What about inflation or recession? Is gas going to go up again this summer? We might see that. What about the stock market? Will it sink if that happens? What happened about polarization and democracy? Here are armed protesters in Michigan. With the denial and continuing questioning of the election results of 2020 by many Americans, the very foundations of democracy are being threatened. Some have suggested there may be a possibility of armed conflict in the future. Is it already happening? An intruder breaks into Nancy Pelosi's home and almost kills her husband. The threats against public officials, Congress, and judges has increased. While high-profile people can be protected, ordinary Congress people and their families are at risk. Also, election officials have talked about threats to their families, threats to themselves in the future. Those are some of the threats all taken together. Is there a pattern, or is there an indication that something else is going on? Here's a man called Immanuel Wallerstein. He's a world systems analysis. A little bit about him, because I think it's necessary to know. He's a sociologist, but his first job was in West Africa. And when he went to West Africa, he began asking sociological questions. And he found out that it was almost totally irrelevant, because the economics of West Africa blotted out everything. I happen to understand some of this because my first job was in West Africa, in Nigeria. And all the things that I had learned about politics and people got changed because none of the same rules applied. For example, I learned that in America, if you work hard and you're very dedicated, at least in those days, you could get ahead. And found out that if you lived in Nigeria, no matter how hard you work, you're going to be poor, because everybody in Nigeria was poor, except for a few corrupt people. And so all of a sudden you realize that you can't just study a single subject like sociology, because it's related to economics, it's related to politics, it's related to a whole country in a whole system. And this is why Wallerstein became a systems analysis. And for some of the people who know the phrase dependency theory, that there are core nations, which are rich nations, or there are peripheral nations, which are poor nations, and there are semi-peripheral nations. That's some of the ones that are trying to make it. That came from the popularization by Wallerstein. And so he's increasingly well thought of as someone who needs to be listened to in terms of the whole world. He's written a number of books, and this is one that caught my eye. It starts reading from the middle up, The End of the World as We Know It, Social Science for the 21st Century. What are the origins of the modern world? Here's Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Around 1500, two intertwined events took place. The first was the beginning of successful nation states like Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, and France. Now, we've always had so-called nations like England and France under the Plantagenets and about Henry V and all that. But these kings were not very powerful. There was no central administration. Oftentimes, there was no central army. It wasn't until about the 1500s that you start getting a national entity, a centration of bureaucrats, of central authority, of central fundraising, and that happened around 1500 to a few states. The second intertwining event was the beginning of capitalism as the economic system, which would last until the present. These two now remain the foundation of what we call reality. The origins of capitalism. Under feudalism, there were fixed orders of society. You were born a lord, you were born a serf, and you stayed that way. You couldn't go anywhere. You were stuck, or you were privileged and you could end up that way. Under capitalism, anyone can rise in society. You can start poor, but you made wise investments, or you were a crook, you could rise in society. Feudalism had a barter economy. I'll bring you my beef, you give me your grain. Under capitalism, all of a sudden you have a market economy in the cities, and it now is much broader, and you can deal with people you've never seen before. Under feudalism, there was no money for exchange. Under capitalism, we have money. And so it's not a matter of beef versus grain. It's a matter of little money can buy anything. Under feudalism, landed long-time wealth yields power. Under capitalism, if you just made $1 million, like some people in the high-tech industry, all of a sudden you have more power, and you can take on senators, you can take on leaders of corporations. If your name is Zuckerberg, gosh, you can do great things. Bill Gates was nothing when he was a high school student. Now all of a sudden, whoo, he's a big man. How capitalism becomes the pattern of the world economy. How did it happen? The Black Death killed a lot of people, 1300s or so. One of the results of that is that serfs left the feudal system. They had to. And when they left the feudal system, the power of the nobility went down. And that left the power of the kings to rise. Then came the Protestant Reformation. And of all things, it threatened the Roman Catholics' prohibition on interest. During the Middle Ages, you were not supposed to, though some did, lend money for interest. If you were a Christian, you could not do it to Christians. If you were Jewish, you couldn't do it to Jewish, but Jews could do it to Christians, and Christians could do it to Jews. And so you didn't have much of this. But under Protestantism, all of a sudden, we find out that capitalism becomes a virtue. Max Weber wrote a book on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, basically saying, well, these people in Holland, they worked hard, they invested wisely, and they made a lot of money. As a result, it must mean that God loved them. And so all of a sudden, from interest being a sin to now it being, well, a sign of God's favor, you have a tremendous change and capitalism takes over. Capitalism goes around the world, makes the world go round. Here's something that Minnesota has to offer the world, the Mall of America, one of the largest malls in the world. Capitalism is the basis of supply, employment, management, manufacturing, and commerce. Neither communism or socialism have been able to provide credible alternatives to capitalism as a dominant world economic system. It works in some places at some times. We think of the Scandinavian countries as being very successful socialist countries. Communism perhaps was successful for a bit of time in the Soviet Union and some other countries. China calls itself communist, whether it is or not is a debate, and certainly is not that capitalist, but we begin to see, well, capitalism makes China go around too. So it's the dominant world system at the moment. I'm having trouble reading this. Capitalism is in trouble. Slums throughout Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, capitalism has been unable to provide decent jobs and housing for millions of young people coming onto the job market. This leads to youth violence and probably even to youth violence in America. And it also is the result of armed rebellion elsewhere. Because of the failure of capitalism to help poor countries, there are likely to be more failed states and refugees. Paying for climate remedies. There's been some agreement as to what the world should do about climate change. The problem is, who's going to pay for it? Should energy and transportation and companies be charged for climate damage? Should oil companies be made to pay for the air pollution they cause or the extra emission of CO2. That's going to be hard to get through. Should all the companies of the rich world be charged for climate disasters in poor countries? Well, that's going to be a hard one to get through. Or should nations simply tax corporations more to have enough to pay for climate damage? That's going to be a subject on which there's a lot of debate, and it's likely not to work. So that we have a lot of agreement on what needs to be done for climate change. But we also have a lot of disappointment. It is certainly not happening as fast as it needs to happen. And so this impinges on how successful capitalism is as a world system. A loss of cheap labor. For the past 500 years, the majority of the world's people lived on a farm. That's no longer true. When people left the farm, they provided cheap labor. As a result, we no longer have as many people living on the farm, and so there's not as many people getting off the farm. In fact, in a fascinating study, the Chinese are now trying to pay peasants to come off the farm and work in the factories. And they're having a hard time doing it. With less rural people, there's going to be a dearth of people willing to work for low wages. This means that the cost of labor will continue to rise worldwide, cutting into the profits of enterprises. Where I live in a retirement home, we've already had to cut back services greatly because we can't find people willing to work for the low wages that we have. It's much worse in some homes where they just have assisted living or memory care. You can see it in signs. McDonald's is looking for workers and everybody else is looking for low-cost workers, and they're drying up. So there's a current shortage of low-cost, low-wage workers, certainly throughout the United States at the moment. Shrinking markets. Here's a favela, or a poor area, on a hillside overlooking Rio de Janeiro. While the need for food, energy, housing, transportation are growing tremendously around the world, the number of people who can pay for what they get is not keeping up. As a result, the manufacturers only make products cheap for people who can pay for it in a shrinking market. When I look at the ads on TV and see all of the advertisements for things that I don't really need, or I'm thinking the people in this favela outside of Rio de Janeiro, what they really need, all of a sudden I see there's this tremendous disconnect between what manufacturers are making and what people are needing. And so it begins to show a tremendous crisis that confronts capitalism around the world. Rising inequality. For good returns on investment, investors look for new products or hedge fund opportunities. But a lack of investment in poorer communities just produces more violence and migrants. I'm going to throw it open for discussion now.
Hi, can I be heard?
We can hear you.
Great. I have actually two questions. The first is, how did the Black Death lead to serfs leaving the lands that they were supposed to be tied to? And the second question is, I understood the original idea of capitalism being you used money to buy machines which increased labor. And that was the idea of capitalism. But you seem to be using a very different definition. Could you expand on it a little?
First of all, I don't have all the details. The quote that I was getting, that Serb, when the Black Death and Serbs leaving were probably spread out over 2 centuries. And I don't know the exact connection there. I do know that both weakened the power of the feudal nobles. But what the connection was between the Black Death and the Serbs leaving, I really don't know that. The second question, capitalism to provide things for labor. Capitalism, when it began, probably was less for providing machinery as it was to fund Dutch ships going to the Indies for spices. That was kind of Max Weber's view of the beginnings of capitalism. Indeed, when it got industrialized, yet you had a lot of people working and coming off the farms or being forced off the farms and providing labor for the industry.
So what you are calling, what some used to call mercantilism,
Right.
you were saying that's capitalism.
That was the beginning of it until Adam Smith came along and said it wasn't very efficient.
Thank you.
We have a question from Friendly House. Come on in, Richard.
Hello. I was wondering, you mentioned this, the oncoming shortage of cheap labor,
Right.
and how much is that going to be alleviated by automation, by robotics, by the ability to manufacture things without the use of cheap labor? It seems like that's something that particularly large multinational companies are going to be moving toward.
Right. Somebody else has asked me about that previously. What it seems that robotics, et cetera, seems to work very much in manufacturing and so forth. Where the cheap labor is coming in is in social services. And that's where right now we're finding a fault. And whether or not you can get robots to take care of old people like me, I don't know. Maybe it can help a little bit. Whether they can serve hamburgers at McDonald's, I don't know. So I think that robots are great for manufacturing, but whether or not they're able to take care of people, I don't know. I think that remains to be seen.
Joyce here at Friendly House. Go ahead, Joyce, with your question.
Hello, Dr. Schmidt. I probably have a very oversimplified sense of how an economy works, but is the fact that we refuse to pay higher wages for the people who come and work in service industries, is that simply a matter of the capitalists being cheapskates? The profits that they're sharing with shareholders are humongous. I don't know if that's a word, but and yet they won't pay people to come and help in the nursing homes or
I think that you're absolutely right. It is a matter of that because it would cut into profits. And what should I say? That's gonna hurt to a point. Well, put it this way: if you raise wages, then of course they're going to raise prices, and you're going to get more inflation. And so right now they're going to talk about saying we cannot raise those wages because otherwise it will lead to more inflation. I think that's phony because I think the profits and the inequality is of such a magnitude that they could give a lot more money, and we would get more labor. I think that also if mothers could get much better health, home care, child care, then of course they could free up more women to work. And right now, of course, that's a political football. But I think it would really be wonderful if there was much better child care, and you already would release a lot of women to help in particularly child care, care of aged, and other things that unfortunately are still low cost labor.
Thank you. Todd, you had a question come in from Zoom.
Dr. Schmidt, it's great to see you again. You look fantastic. It's difficult to know at this stage of your presentation, and I know this is part of a series, so I'm sure that my question will be addressed later, but maybe you can give a little preview. The scope of our problems is so big, and there's so many of them, and we have a polarized country, we have a polarized world, that normally when you have a scope of problems this big, it's only the academics that are speaking about it and really trying to put forth ideas. Is that the case here, or are there organizations and businesses and other leaders that you think are effectively trying to deal with these problems?
We're trying to deal with them oftentimes in a nationalistic way. It's the only thing we can do. There's almost no world politics. And this is going to be part of the heart of these 4 sessions, that we're going to have to deal with some things more internationally than we just can nationally. And so part of today's presentation will be the great contradiction, that we're trying to address world problems through national solutions. And that comes up short. And so how we're able to begin to do international things is the substance of what we're going to get to in sessions 3 and 4. The threat to the nations. We talked to the threat to the economy. Right now, there's a Tamil-speaking radio station in Stockholm, Sweden. The Tamil is a section in southern India. And so there are so many inhabitants from that part of southern India who speak Tamil that they have so many people in Stockholm, Sweden, that they have their own radio station. I happened to be in Paris last summer, and there's an Afghan section in Paris. The whole section is in Afghans. There's a new Somalia homeland here in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is the 2nd largest Somali city in the world. There are so many Somalis who live here. In Twin Falls, Idaho, a very white state, Idaho's school system needs translators for 76 different languages. Refugees are not welcome. An increasingly vocal group is not happy. Back there is a Norwegian flag. Putting Brexit over the top. We want our country back. Vote to leave. Together with economic and nationalist sentiments, the anti-immigrant feeling helped to move Great Britain to leave the European Union. France moves to the right. Here's Le Pen, who is an anti-immigrant, has an anti-immigrant platform of the French right. It's interesting enough that in the riots we've had in France, in Paris, over the retirement age, they didn't vote on it. But if Macron is further weakened and the people don't know what to do on it, they say that Le Pen and her party is going to get stronger in France. Le Pen's national rally in the last election won seats, their airtime, and more money in the French vote. The far-right party gained enough seats to preserve a no confidence vote and exceeded even its own expectations in the voting booth. Hungary builds a wall. Here's Viktor Orban of Hungary. He's used anti-immigrant rhetoric to attain and stay in power. He's become the leader of the far-right movement in Europe, so that in Germany, the alt-right looks up to him for leadership. And he's one who's been hesitant in supporting the EU in its help for Ukraine. He opposes much of what the European Union stands for with regard to human rights and immigrants. He's built a wall against migration to and through Hungary, so that when it comes to shall we build a wall, he did. Italy elects an anti-immigrant prime minister. Here's Giorgia Meloni of Italy. Mrs. Meloni wants a naval blockade to stop migrants leaving Libya, and Matteo Salvi is known to covet the job of interior minister, which he left 3 years ago. However, he's currently, I can't read this. He's currently criticized for barring a boat as part of his policy to close down ports to rescue boats. Sweden moves to the right. Here's the election victory party in Sweden. In Sweden, voters delivered the mandate after elections which is a loose coalition of right-wing parties, including one with a neo-fascist past. The kingmakers of Sweden are on the right, Sweden Democrats, founded in 1988 by ultranationalist extremists and neo-Nazis. This is Sweden. Over the past decade, they've moved from the fringes of their country's politics into the mainstream. In America, Governors Abbott and DeSantis have dramatized the refugee issue and made it one of the chief issues of the midterm elections. And it's a continuation of the build a wall refrain of the Trump administration. And it appeals to the fear of being overrun by immigrants. Both of them have sent immigrants from Texas to New York. DeSantis, living in Florida, sent buses to Texas to illustrate his solution to the problem. A question of identity. Our nation is often the chief source of our identity. It's symbolized in the flag, in the memory of those died fighting for our nation. With migrants and refugees, more and more of them, that identity is getting threatened, and explains the right turn in world politics. And now we come to the current contradiction. The biggest problems our world faces are global in nature. Addressing and working toward them is beyond the power of any nation. Yet the politics of nearly all nations are chiefly about the effects of those world problems on their nation, and not on the problems themselves. Worldwide inflation. Here's the European inflation rates from October 21 to July of 2022, caused in part by recovery from the pandemic and global supply chain issues. In America, it's blamed on the administration as if its behavior might have averted the problem. The UN has an international presence and infrastructure, but it depends on specific nations for financial help. I think I told you this in a previous lecture at the Humanists. The UN has the same budget or less than New York City. This means that almost all extra money for UN refugees, for UN food assistance, for humanitarian things has to be raised extra. And thank goodness a lot of it is working, but it is probably too short. Failed states. Here they are again. Sri Lanka, Venezuela, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Myanmar, Somalia, Haiti, and Honduras. Seldom does the world know what to do with failed states. When a large power intervenes, it often causes more conflict. At times, the UN sends in peacekeeping forces, but oftentimes they bring in additional problems. Haiti has always been a problem, and the last time they sent in UN peacekeeping forces, and the forces brought in cholera. In the Eastern Congo, UN forces came in, and they started realizing that the UN troops were beginning to try to enrich themselves with diamonds and gold, just like some of the other people. And so you've had some additional problems even with UN troops. And for other nations, these countries are out of sight, out of mind. Migrants and refugees. The politics of migrants and refugees is highly contentious in almost every country, which is sort of being invaded by them. National arguments to keep them out or let them in. And yet no nation is capable of addressing all of the causes of the need to migrate. Political solutions. Making worries worse is that while problems are global in nature, our politics are only national. This means current political arguments are often irrelevant to solving the international problems. Now, international help is available. Here are Doctors Without Borders in Haiti. Non-government organizations are doing marvelous things. And aid from governments is also valuable. We have AID and other countries are doing tremendous work. But the chief problems remain that without an international strategy, many of the overwhelming problems just continue. Next time, lessons from history. Are we approaching a system shift? The fall of the Roman Empire and other world systems. We've had two big ones. One was the fall of the Roman Empire and the opening up to the Middle Ages and to feudalism. And then the second shift was from feudalism in the Middle Ages to capitalism in the nation state system. And are we entering another system shift? And we're going to see that there may be lessons from history that we can at least address some of that. Okay, discussion.
Oh, wow.
As you said, going through the history, you find that the dominant powers or empires have lives of maybe a century or two, maybe Roman Empire with the exception. And so the British Empire was the last one. And the US has been, the US has been the dominant one for the last 100 years, but it's coming down. Now with the loss of the dominant empire, is that going to be easier to solve the worldwide problems or going to be more difficult because there will be a chaotic equilibrium? So that question is important, especially in the light of climate change. This has to be done with the world over, because even a dominant nation will suffer if the others do not follow up the climate change issues. So what do you think is going to happen in the light of this loosening of the control by dominant powers?
That's an excellent question. As you mentioned, Great Britain was a dominant power for 100, maybe 200 years. Before that, Holland was a dominant power, and before that, Portugal was. Each one of them is matched with a countervailing power. So that with Portugal, it was Spain. With Holland, it was France. With Great Britain, it was the second part of it. It was Germany. With the United States, it was Russia. Right now, if there's a world war, it's going to be who is going to dominate the next century. Will it be the United States or China? And that's what world wars are fought over. Now, your question is whether or not a world power will be able to take care of the whole thing. I doubt it. I doubt it. I think that what needs to happen is a growing global awareness. And one of the interesting things is that if there's going to be any rapprochement between China and the United States right now, it may be on climate change. Whether there's something comes of that, I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see.
So you hinted at a stratification and the mobilization that occurs. I just wanted to ask if the stratification of wealth, particularly where it comes to passive income, points to a kind of destabilization which may in some ways be terminal to modern society. Do you see that behavior as going in a particular direction?
If I understand your question, you're talking about people who have tremendous amounts of money and have tucked that away and make it non-taxable and so forth. And Thomas Piketty, in his big book on capitalism, has called for a worldwide tax on wealth, not income. And he believes that's the only answer to capitalism. I'm going to jump ahead of myself a little bit. Wallerstein believes that capitalism will end in the next 50 years. Not because of communism, not because of socialism, but it simply has so many contradictions within itself that it's going to end. And what's going to replace it, he does not believe in anything like progress. He says, we don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to be a improved capitalism? Is it going to be a socialism that works? Is it going to be a communism without Stalin? We don't know those answers. But I think it's interesting to at least ask the question that if capitalism isn't working, what's it going to be next? And some people have said, live next to a farm. It may be bartering again.
Jeff, you're here at Friendly House.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Great to have you back again. Do you see parallels between the tendency for capitalism to not want government regulation, individual taxpayers not to want their taxes increased, and nation states not wanting to form an effective UN?
According to Wallerstein, he has an interesting point of view. He says that capitalism needs nation states like crazy. Even though it seems like they're fighting each other, who enforces the fact that there's such things as patents? What if there were no patents? What if there was no tariffs? Free enterprise is enough to weaken every capitalist enterprise if it's free. But they depend on nations to make sure that it's not free.
I'll try to be coherent.
Thank you.
Our problems are complex, and we can only think in simplistic models. Is it a possibility that AI can get a handle on some of these things? And since that's going to be owned by corporations, does that mean we're in big trouble?
You just had this guy from Google saying, watch out for it. I helped to invent it. It could be nasty. I don't know what AI can do. I'm not an expert at that at all. I keep thinking of who's going to take care of the kids, and whether AI can do that, I don't know. Whether they can help us out in serving meals, I don't know. I happen to believe that we've underestimated what it is to live together as people. That is not a robotic thing. And I think we're seeing the effects of that in the fact that our kids can't talk to each other except through cell phones. And I think that they need to relate to each other as people, as we do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Next.
Preston, you have a question.
Dr. Schmidt, thank you. In 1900, our population was approximately 1 billion. Today, the world population is 8 billion. Have we just overgrown ourselves? Is this what it's going to take? And are we going to have to die off to 2 billion to make this whole thing work? That's my question. Thank you.
Actually, statistics are that you may be right, but it's significant that China has gone down, that even in Africa, which is where the largest explosion is supposed to happen, even in Africa, births are down. The United States, as a result, would actually be losing population if it weren't for migration. And a number of countries are getting pro-natalist, doing everything they can to increase population. Now, what those signals are in terms of totals, I don't know. And there are still people who say we're getting way too big. But there's others who say for the first time, we're beginning to see some limits to population. Now, whether that'll be in time, I don't know.
But the projections are for 10 billion before we start to really go down.
No. So it's going to be bigger before it gets smaller, Harry.
All right. Go ahead, Dakota.
Just a moment, let me hear this.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Good morning, Dr. Schmidt. My question is if about the international contradiction. What's to stop basically any nation or nation state? How are we to solve global problems if there are some problems which benefit certain nation states over others? How can we come to an agreement politically among that?
I haven't got the faintest idea.
Right. It's such a big problem to these nation states when there's a global. I mean, you presented it so clearly. It's a global problems, and yet we're trying to solve it with nations. My question is, when we consider the United States and immigration, there's also this new, over the last 50 years, the fact that women and people of color and Native Americans are saying, we want a piece of the pie. We want to be considered equal. What do you think that influence of democracy, saying all men are created equal, meaning humans, all humans are created equal, how is that affecting the United States in this issues?
It's a huge issue. And of course, the way our government is structured at the present is it's not that democratic. Insofar as there's been huge amounts of time and effort to limit the votes of those people who are at the bottom. And until you get a whole different idea of how we can not only change voting, but also change lobbying, change the way we even think about politics in America and elsewhere. As we get to the third section, we're going to be talking about what are the pathways forward. And we'll say that there's going to be two paths to choose from. One is a pathway of coercion, and the other is a pathway of consensus. And the pathway of consensus means that everybody needs to be consented. We got to get the consent How do we say that? Everybody's got to have a say. And how that happens will depend on a lot of things. But that certainly is going to be a major issue.
Well, and talking about consensus, I just got back from Buffalo, New York, and Western New York area, and I realized my reality and their reality are two different things. I was in Trump country, and the realities are so different. It was good to be home, to be perfectly honest. And how do we deal, even in America, even in the United States, with these two very separate realities and where people are getting their information?
Right. Mm-hmm. That's huge, and I don't have the answer to that one.
Yeah, yeah. If I had heard one more time that there was kitty litter in the bathrooms of public schools, I wanted to scream. Everywhere I went, they told me the story about the kitty litter because children are deciding they want to be cats. And so they're putting kitty litter in the bathrooms. And it just was like, no, that's not true. But I kept hearing it over and over and over again. But it happened. We have time for some more questions. Anybody from here he comes. Hang on, Dr. Schmidt. Al Christians is heading to the microphone. He always asks pretty tough, he asks tough questions. Be kind.
I'm warned. I'm pre-warned.
Is there a chance that we're going to discover that the proper role of government is to deliver the news that the world is a very cruel place in the nicest possible way?
I don't know if the government will announce that, but I think we can. And I think that once you understand that it is kind of a nasty place and you start working on solutions, let me give you a picture. This Wallerstein is a great scholar and whatever. And he said, one of the problems with social science has been a divorce from what you might call morality. And I was studying political science, we basically wanted to make sure that we were objective. And we looked at what was right. We would not take rights and wrongs. We wouldn't look at that. And he said, because of that, a lot of social science has been kind of value-free. And so he said, that's been a terrible thing because it's kept us from talking about what ought to be. And he said, I've got a suggestion. We ought to talk about utopistics. I never heard that word before. Utopistics is thinking about what ought to be, the utopia. Now, utopia usually has the context of it'll never happen. But what if utopia meant this is something we ought to aim for? He said, and if social science then would devote it to itself, what are the things that are necessary to achieve what ought to happen? We would have something to work with. And social science wouldn't be used to describe what is. It would be how in the world do we get to what ought to be? Mm-hmm. And I think that, believe it or not, there's enough unity in our thinking. You can use humanist beliefs and say, okay, let's go for that. And there may be others who will contribute toward it that are about the same things. And so now how do we then go and achieve those things? Do we cancel nations? Do we take our loyalties and give it to something bigger and broader than our country? Do we change our identity? Do we change the way we think about things? Those are the questions that we're going to keep asking.
I mean, Dr. Schmidt, here we are today, a group of humanists, you're a Christian theologian. I mean, and we share so many common thoughts and common beliefs.
Right.
And we've learned so much from you,
Right.
so much from you, and are going to continue to learn so much from you over the next few weeks. Yes. Now tell it, you're going to be here next? What's going on?
Well, I'm there because I have to preach at a funeral of a friend and a colleague. And that's not as bad a news as it seems, because he's 92 years old, a warm, long, good life, somebody to celebrate. And so that's not that bad of news, but it's a chance for me to be there. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Well, I'm very pleased. We'll see you next week. So you'll be here Sunday, 9:30 to set up with the AV guys.
I'll be here. I'll be there.
All right. That sounds great. Well, we're out of questions and we're out of time.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Say it again. Okay. Hank, come on. I missed you. I'm so sorry.
Well, if we're out of time, we're out.
We're not out of time. We can extend.
So I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Schmidt, the person who raised the question about there are just too many of us.
Yeah.
It didn't seem to me that you were taking that as a serious possibility of our difficulties. Now, I realized that when we were at 1 billion, the world was still a pretty nasty place. But the carrying capacity of any environment is limited. And why do you not think the problems that or the things that we are seeing are simply a function of there's too many of us?
Partly because that issue was raised many, many years ago. And all of a sudden, the idea that we were going to run out of food really didn't happen. We ran out of the way of sharing the food, definitely. Whether or not the environment is a problem simply because too many people are driving cars and there are too many people doing it, that's an issue that we need to talk about. And it may be true. I'm on the basis of history, though. I don't think Malthus was 100% right because he didn't take into consideration a lot of other stuff. In terms of seeds, I just been working on the Green Revolution, and it's got a lot of problems. But boy, increasing production 400% per year in some places of India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan used to import wheat. Now they import wheat. Now they export wheat. That was never foreseen by Malthus. Now, whether or not that lesson can be applied to something like climate change, I don't really know yet. I'm hopeful.
Thank you.
Thank you.